In the heart of Busan, South Korea, a fortress-like institution stood hidden from the public eye. Officially, it was called Brothers' Home, a government-backed facility designed to rehabilitate the homeless, vagrants, and petty criminals, helping them reintegrate into society. But what happened behind its heavily guarded walls was something far more sinister. In the 1970s, South Korea was undergoing rapid economic growth, transforming itself from a war-torn nation into a rising industrial power. But with this transformation came a hidden war against the poor, a brutal campaign to erase the visible signs of poverty from the streets. The government, eager to present an image of progress and modernization, viewed homelessness, vagrancy, and even minor criminal activity as a stain on society. This was the environment in which Brothers' Home was born. Located in Busan, Brothers' Home was originally established as a rehabilitation facility, supposedly created to help the homeless, beggars, petty criminals, and troubled youths find a path to a better life. The idea, on paper, seemed noble. People who had nowhere to go would be given shelter, food, and vocational training to prepare them for employment. But this idealistic image was a carefully crafted lie. Instead of being a center for rehabilitation, Brothers' Home quickly transformed into a prison-like labor camp, where people were abducted, confined against their will, and forced to work under inhumane conditions. The facility was overseen by authoritarian leadership, protected by corrupt officials, and driven by a system of abuse, torture, and exploitation that would continue for over a decade. The rise of Brothers' Home was not an accident. It was directly fueled by government policies that prioritized erasing homelessness over actually solving it. In 1975, South Korea's military dictator, President Park Chung-hee, enacted the Vagrancy Act, which gave police and local officials the power to round up anyone they deemed undesirable. Under this law, the definition of vagrant became shockingly broad. Anyone who was unemployed, appeared poor, or simply did not carry identification could be taken off the streets without trial or due process. Brothers' Home quickly became the largest facility of its kind, receiving millions in government funding under the pretense of helping South Korea's economic transformation. But in reality, it operated more like a concentration camp, where those deemed unworthy of being seen in public were brutalized and erased from society. The recruitment process for Brothers' Home was horrifyingly simple. People were kidnapped in broad daylight. Police officers, working alongside facility enforcers, would sweep the streets, capturing anyone who looked poor, disabled, or mentally ill. Some victims were young children, taken while their parents were at work. Others were perfectly normal citizens who simply forgot their identification while running errands. Even tourists and students were sometimes caught in these raids, mistaken for vagrants, and dragged to Brothers' Home with no way to escape. The abducted individuals were thrown into overcrowded trucks, chained together, and transported to the facility, where they would begin a nightmarish new existence. By the late 1970s, the number of detainees had risen to over 4,000, many of whom had no criminal record, no history of homelessness, and no way to contact their families. At the heart of Brothers' Home's reign of terror was its director, Park In-gun, a man who ruled with absolute power and cruelty. He operated the facility as his personal kingdom, enforcing a system of forced labor, beatings, and starvation to control the prisoners. Under his leadership, Brothers' Home was not just a prison, it was a factory. The detainees were forced to work long hours in sweatshops, producing goods that were then sold for profit. Many of these goods were exported, meaning that businesses and foreign buyers unknowingly benefited from slave labor. Park's rule was unquestioned, and because of his close ties to the government, any reports of abuse were ignored or silenced. But as the facility expanded, so did the horrors within. Torture, death, and mass graves were just the beginning of what awaited those imprisoned at the rehabilitation camp. And the worst was yet to come. For the thousands of people taken to Brothers' Home, the nightmare began the moment they arrived. Many had been abducted off the streets without warning, thrown into the backs of police trucks, and transported to a place they had never heard of before. Some had been walking home from school, others had been shopping or waiting for a bus. One moment they were free. The next, they were prisoners in a brutal labor camp, stripped of their identities and forgotten by society. But their horror was just beginning. Brothers' Home was not a rehabilitation center. It was a prison built on suffering. New arrivals at the camp were greeted with violence and humiliation. As soon as the trucks arrived at the facility, guards dragged the prisoners out and forced them to kneel in submission. Anyone who hesitated or asked questions was beaten on the spot. One survivor later recalled how he was kicked and punched repeatedly, forced to crawl on the ground while guards shouted commands like military officers. Those who cried or resisted were made examples of, their punishment escalating into severe beatings or starvation. Many were shocked to see children among them, some as young as 7 years old, forced to endure the same abuse as adults. Some had been kidnapped off the streets while playing, others had been separated from their parents in public and mistaken for orphans. None of them knew why they were there. Once processed, detainees were sorted into overcrowded barracks where they were packed together like animals. Some rooms, meant for 20 people, held over 100, with prisoners forced to sleep shoulder to shoulder on the cold cement floor. There were no mattresses, no blankets, no privacy, just the constant stench of sweat, filth, and fear. Food was barely enough to survive. Each prisoner received a small bowl of rice, sometimes mixed with spoiled vegetables or insects. Those who worked the hardest were occasionally given a thin soup as a reward. Those who disobeyed were starved as punishment, but hunger was not the worst thing the prisoners endured. Every detainee at Brothers' Home was forced to work, regardless of age or health. The facility operated like a massive sweatshop, producing textiles, shoes, and cheap consumer goods that were sold for profit. Some prisoners worked from sunrise to sunset, stitching garments or assembling products in factories located inside the facility. Others were sent outside to perform dangerous labor, such as construction, farming, or working in mines, tasks that were grueling and often fatal. Anyone who refused to work was subjected to severe punishments, ranging from brutal beatings to solitary confinement in tiny, windowless cells. Some were tied up and left in darkness for days without food or water. Others were hung upside down from the ceiling and beaten until they lost consciousness. One former prisoner later described the labor as a slow form of death. Many collapsed from exhaustion and malnutrition, only to be dragged away and never seen again. Brothers' Home was not just a prison, it was a death sentence for thousands of people. Prisoners who fell sick or were too weak to work were disposed of in horrifying ways. Some were simply left to die, their bodies later hauled away and buried in unmarked graves. Others were beaten to death for failing to meet their work quotas. Even children were not spared. Many died from starvation, untreated illnesses, or abuse at the hands of the guards. But the true horror of Brothers' Home was how easily people vanished without a trace. Families who searched for missing loved ones were ignored or threatened. There were no official records of who entered the facility, and when someone died, their existence was simply erased. Years later, when investigations finally exposed what had happened, mass graves were discovered near the facility, filled with the remains of those who never made it out. Perhaps the most terrifying part of Brothers' Home was that no one could leave. There was no trial, no legal process, and no way to prove your innocence. Even if a prisoner wasn't homeless, wasn't a criminal, and had a family waiting for them, it didn't matter. Once they were inside, they ceased to exist to the outside world. Some prisoners attempted to escape, but the facility was heavily guarded, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. Those who were caught were punished in the most brutal ways imaginable. Some were beaten so severely that their bodies were dumped in the nearby river, a warning to others who dared to try. For the thousands trapped inside, Brothers' Home was not a place of rehabilitation. It was a labor camp, a torture center, and for many, a final destination. For over a decade, this horror continued, protected by a web of corruption and government neglect. But eventually one man would risk everything to expose the truth. And when he did, the world would finally see the nightmare that had been hidden for years. Inside Brothers' Home, suffering was not just a consequence of captivity, it was the foundation of the institution itself. Every day, prisoners endured brutal forced labor, relentless torture, and inhuman punishments that turned the facility into a living nightmare. Those who entered its walls were no longer seen as human beings. They became slaves, experiments, and ultimately, disposable bodies. As the years passed, the atrocities within grew more extreme, more systematic, and more terrifying, transforming Brothers Home into one of the worst human rights abuses in South Korea's modern history. From the moment the sun rose until well after nightfall, prisoners were forced into grueling labor. The facility operated like a vast industrial complex, supplying textiles, shoes, and manufactured goods to private companies. The profits flowed upward to the facility's director, government officials, and corporations that benefited from the slave labor. Many detainees worked sewing clothes, cutting fabrics, or assembling consumer products under horrific conditions. The rooms were stifling hot, filled with the stench of sweat and untreated wounds. There were no breaks, no safety measures, and no medical treatment for injuries. For those assigned to agricultural or construction work, conditions were even worse. Prisoners were forced to farm crops, dig trenches, and build structures, sometimes with their bare hands. Many collapsed from exhaustion, dehydration, or malnutrition, but those who stopped working were met with beatings and punishments that were often fatal. One former detainee described how an elderly prisoner collapsed in the fields after days without food or water. Rather than allowing him to rest, the guards dragged him away, tied him to a post, and left him to die under the scorching sun. His body was never seen again. The guards at Brothers Home enforced obedience through terror. Punishments were handed out daily, often for the smallest infractions, speaking out of turn, moving too slowly, or failing to meet work quotas. The brutality was indiscriminate. Children, the elderly, and the disabled were treated no differently than the strongest prisoners. One of the most feared punishments was the box, a windowless cell where prisoners were locked in complete darkness for weeks at a time. The space was too small to sit or stand properly, forcing victims into unnatural, painful positions that left them permanently disfigured. Some never emerged alive. Starvation was another common method of control. Prisoners who disobeyed were denied food for days at a time, leaving them too weak to resist or fight back. Some became so desperate that they ate insects or scraps of discarded waste just to survive. Beatings were routine, often carried out as public spectacles. Survivors later recalled how prisoners were forced to kneel in the yard while guards kicked and whipped them until they lost consciousness. Those who could not stand afterward were dragged away, their fates unknown. Some of the most disturbing reports about Brothers Home suggested that the facility was not just a labor camp, but a place where human experimentation took place. Detainees reported unusual medical procedures, where prisoners were taken into underground rooms, injected with unknown substances, and never seen again. Others spoke of disciplinary surgeries, procedures performed without anesthesia, where prisoners had body parts mutilated as punishment. One particularly horrifying claim involved intentional exposure to disease, where prisoners were kept in contaminated rooms and monitored to see how long they would survive. Those who died were disposed of in mass graves without record. To this day, the full extent of the medical experiments at Brothers Home remains unknown, as many of the records were destroyed before authorities could investigate. Death was an inevitable fate for many prisoners. The sick were abandoned, the injured were left untreated, and the weak were disposed of like trash. When mass graves were later uncovered near the facility, human remains showed signs of torture, broken bones, and untreated wounds. Some bodies had no hands or feet, suggesting amputation as punishment. Others were found with cloth stuffed into their mouths, an indication that they had been silenced before their deaths. Those who died from beatings or starvation were often dumped in the nearby Nakdong River, a method of disposal that ensured no official death records would exist. Some families later reported receiving letters from Brothers Home informing them that their relatives had escaped or gone missing, but in reality, they had already been buried in unmarked graves. For over a decade, this horror continued unchecked. Thousands died, thousands more suffered, and no one on the outside knew the full extent of the nightmare. Despite whispers of abuse, no one dared to challenge the system. The director of Brothers Home, Park In-gun, was a powerful man with deep government connections. Any reports of abuse were dismissed as exaggerations. Officials who could have shut the facility down chose to look the other way. The forced labor brought in millions in profit, and as long as the money flowed, no one cared what happened inside the walls. For over a decade, Brothers Home operated in darkness, hidden behind layers of government corruption and public ignorance. Thousands of innocent people had been abducted, tortured, and killed, their suffering buried beneath a system designed to erase them from society. But in 1987, everything changed. It took one man, a whistleblower willing to risk his career, his safety, and even his life, to finally bring the truth to light. And when the world saw what had been happening inside Brothers Home, the horror was too great to ignore. The first person to officially expose the horrors of Brothers Home was Kwon Seong-ho, a prosecutor from Busan. Unlike many others in the justice system, Kwon refused to look the other way when reports of abuse reached his desk. For years there had been whispers about Brothers Home, rumors of people disappearing, families never hearing from their loved ones again, and a facility that operated more like a forced labor camp than a rehabilitation center. But no one had dared to investigate. Kwon, however, was different. He began digging into the financial records of Brothers Home, and what he found shocked him to his core. The facility was receiving massive amounts of government funding, but there was no transparency on how the money was being used. There were no medical records, no official logs of prisoner deaths, and no legal documentation of how detainees were selected. Determined to uncover the truth, Kwon led a secret raid on Brothers Home in early 1987, arriving with law enforcement officials without warning. What they found was beyond anything they had expected. Inside, prisoners were huddled together in overcrowded, filthy rooms, some barely able to stand from exhaustion and starvation. Many of them had visible scars, signs of severe beatings and abuse. Even more horrifying were the children, some as young as 7, working under the same brutal conditions as the adults. Many had never even known life outside the facility, but the worst discovery was the mass graves. As the raid continued, investigators uncovered human remains buried in unmarked graves, as well as evidence that many more bodies had been secretly disposed of over the years. As the news of the raid spread, the South Korean government scrambled to contain the damage. Officials who had ignored reports of abuse for years now pretended to be shocked, claiming they had no idea what was happening inside the facility. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the public demanded answers. How had this been allowed to continue for so long? The media exploded with outrage, publishing reports that exposed how government officials had profited from Brothers Home while knowingly allowing the abuse to continue. Survivors came forward, sharing horrific testimonies of the torture they had endured. Some described how they had been abducted off the streets, while others told of seeing fellow prisoners beaten to death in front of them. But despite the outcry, true justice never came. The director of Brothers Home, Park In-gun, was arrested, but the punishment he received was shockingly lenient. For running what was essentially a government-backed concentration camp for the deaths of thousands, and for over a decade of unimaginable human rights violations, Park served only 2.5 years in prison. To many, this was a slap in the face to the victims and their families. The people responsible for allowing Brothers Home to exist walked free, their reputations largely untouched. Kwon Seong-ho, the prosecutor who had exposed the truth, was pushed out of his position. Rather than being rewarded for his bravery, he was silenced, his career effectively ruined for daring to challenge the system. The world now knew the truth, but the damage had already been done. Thousands of lives had been destroyed. Countless victims had never been found, their remains lost forever. Even today, many of the perpetrators who benefited from Brothers Home remain unidentified, their crimes buried along with their victims. For the survivors, justice never truly came. And for South Korea, Brothers Home remains one of the darkest, most horrifying chapters in its modern history, a chapter that some still try to forget. But for those who lived through it, the scars remain. And the truth, no matter how much time passes, cannot be erased. When the horrors of Brothers Home were finally exposed in 1987, the world expected swift justice. The evidence was overwhelming. Thousands of innocent people had been kidnapped, enslaved, tortured, and killed, all under the guise of a government-backed rehabilitation program. But instead of justice, what followed was a cover-up so blatant that it only deepened the tragedy. The South Korean government, which had funded, protected and benefited from Brothers Home, worked to bury the scandal rather than hold those responsible accountable. For the survivors and the families of the victims, it was a second betrayal, a confirmation that their suffering had never mattered to those in power. The initial public outrage over Brothers Home was immense. Survivors' testimonies flooded newspapers, describing the years of abuse, forced labor, and mass killings that had taken place behind its walls. Investigative journalists dug into the case, uncovering evidence that high-ranking government officials had turned a blind eye for over a decade. But instead of fully investigating the crimes, the South Korean government worked to minimize the scandal. Officials described the abuses as isolated incidents, rather than part of a systematic, state-backed operation. Government reports framed Brothers Home as an institution that had simply gone wrong, rather than acknowledging that it had been designed to function as a forced labor camp from the beginning. The biggest lie, however, was the claim that most of the detainees had been criminals or vagrants who needed discipline. This was a blatant attempt to justify the mass abductions and to discourage deeper investigations into who had been sent there and why. Despite the scale of the atrocities, only a handful of people were ever prosecuted, and even they received shockingly light sentences. Park In-gun, the director of Brothers Home, was convicted. But for an institution responsible for thousands of deaths and human rights violations, he served only 2.5 years in prison. Other high-ranking officials and government figures who had funded and supported Brothers Home were never prosecuted at all. Many of them continued their political and business careers as if nothing had happened. Even the police officers who had abducted innocent people off the streets faced no real consequences. The very system that had created Brothers Home ensured that those who carried out its crimes would never be punished. The man who had exposed Brothers Home, prosecutor Kwon Seung-ho, should have been hailed as a hero. Without his investigation, the truth might never have come to light. But instead of being rewarded, he was punished. Kwon was forced out of his position, and his career in law was effectively destroyed. He became an unwanted figure, someone the government wanted to forget, just like the victims of Brothers Home. To this day, Kwon remains one of the few individuals who dared to stand against the system, only to be abandoned by it. For the families of those who had disappeared into Brothers Home, the fight for answers never truly ended. Many never found out what happened to their loved ones, as records had been erased, bodies had been disposed of, and witnesses had died in captivity. To this day, no official memorial exists for the victims. The South Korean government has never formally apologized for the atrocities committed within Brothers Home. Unlike other historical human rights violations, this chapter remains largely hidden from public consciousness. Many survivors have struggled with lifelong trauma, unable to forget the horrors they endured. Some have tried to bring lawsuits against the state, but most have been dismissed or ignored. Even the mass graves that were discovered were not fully excavated, and the true death toll remains unknown. The Brothers Home tragedy is more than just a dark chapter in history. It is a wound that remains open, a crime that was never fully answered for. Even today, most South Koreans know little about what happened. The government has made no serious effort to educate the public on the case, and many details remain buried under decades of silence. Time has a way of burying the past, especially when those in power want it forgotten. Despite the unimaginable horrors that took place within Brothers Home, it remains one of the least known atrocities in modern South Korean history. For many survivors, the suffering did not end when the facility was shut down. It continued in the form of government neglect, societal silence, and an ongoing fight to have their stories heard. The victims of Brothers Home have been erased twice. First when they were abducted and locked away, and again when their suffering was swept under the rug. But if history has taught us anything, it is that silence only allows horrors like this to repeat themselves. Unlike other human rights abuses that have received global attention, Brothers Home remains in the shadows. There are few books, documentaries, or public memorials dedicated to the victims. Many South Koreans have never even heard of the facility, despite the fact that it operated for over a decade, affecting thousands of innocent people. For those who endured the nightmare of Brothers Home, the battle for recognition never ended. Many struggled to reintegrate into society, having spent years in captivity with no education, no money, and no support system. Others suffered lifelong trauma, plagued by nightmares, PTSD, and physical injuries from years of abuse. Some survivors have tried to bring lawsuits against the government, demanding justice and compensation for the years stolen from them. Most of these cases have been dismissed. For those who lost family members to the facility, the pain is even greater. No proper investigation was ever conducted into the true number of deaths, and many bodies remain buried in unmarked graves. These families never received closure, never learned what truly happened to their loved ones. They were simply told, they are gone. If history has shown anything, it is that atrocities do not stop when they are forgotten. They only become easier to repeat. Brothers' Home was not an accident. It was a deliberate system of oppression, carried out under the orders of a government that prioritized profit, order, and control over human life. The conditions that made Brothers' Home possible have not disappeared. Governments around the world still abuse their power, still imprison innocent people under false pretenses, and still silence those who try to expose the truth. The story of Brothers' Home is more than just a dark chapter in history. It is a stain on human rights, a horrifying example of what happens when power goes unchecked, when governments prioritize control over compassion, and when society chooses to look the other way. For over a decade, thousands of innocent people were abducted, enslaved, tortured, and killed behind the walls of a facility that was supposed to help them. And when the truth was finally exposed, justice never came. The victims were forgotten, the perpetrators walked free, and the government silenced the story rather than facing accountability. But the scars remain. The survivors still live with the trauma of what they endured. The families of the dead still search for answers that may never come. And the mass graves serve as a chilling reminder of just how many lives were lost, their names erased from history. But we cannot allow this story to fade into silence, because the greatest injustice of all would be to forget, to let the victims of Brothers' Home vanish from memory, just as they were erased from society all those years ago. This story must be told again and again, so that it is never allowed to happen again, because the past can only repeat itself if we refuse to remember.